Check out this interview with Newsmax and Peter Schiff.
Biden administration fashion, the president was touting how great his Inflation Reduction Act is, despite the fact that the awful inflation report this week sends the markets into the worst nosedive since June of 2020. That was the COVID nosedive. Chief economist and global strategist and host of SchiffRadio.com, Peter Schiff, appreciate you joining us, sir.
Oh, my pleasure.
The thing I want to talk about here is, and a lot of people are like, oh, well, you know, it was 9.1, now it's 8.3, it's down 0.8%. Things are getting better because of the Inflation Reduction Act. That's what Joe Biden and his team are saying. However, we have to look at the fact that, like, inflation's not down. If it was down, it'd be negative. It's just up by less. I mean, this is a year-over-year number. Explain how that number should be zero, and anything above that is not down.
Well, in fact, the only reason that the number is down is because we've dumped all this oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and so that's temporarily pushing down oil prices. Now, that's not going to last, but if you look beneath the surface, we're seeing an acceleration in food prices, in shelter, in healthcare. So everything is really going up. We just have one thing right now that's pulled back, but of course, energy prices are still up dramatically from where they were a year ago.
Sure.
So inflation tax is falling even more heavy on middle-class Americans now than it was a few months ago. And the Inflation Reduction Act is actually inappropriately named. It's the Inflation Acceleration Act. And that is going to have consequences next year in helping to push that inflation rate even higher than the inflation from 2022.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I mean, it's not funny actually, but and President Biden he's drained like close to 40% of the strategic petroleum reserves to keep these gas prices lower through November, because without that, they'd be at like $7 a gallon. And now, like we all said, he's got to refill this stuff, and he's refilling it at $80 a barrel, yet Democrats blocked Trump from adding to it at $24 a barrel. Chuck Schumer called it a bailout for big oil. The heck is your take on this?
Well, I don't even think they're going to buy it at 80 because I think if they tried to buy it, the price wouldn't be at 80 for long. It would shoot right back up above 100. Yeah. I think more likely they're going to deplete the reserve until it's empty. And then what are we going to do? Then we'll have no oil to sell. And what if we have an actual emergency and we have shortages? We won't have any strategic reserve to fall back on.
Yeah, heaven forbid we actually have to drill ourselves here. But let's talk about the consumer price index, because sure, it is obviously inflation rose by less last month. However, CPI, consumer price index, is across the grid. Bread is more. Most food actually is more. Milk, eggs, the day-to-day stuff. Obviously, fuel coming down, that's the one driver on this thing. But in November, do you think there's going to be some sort of November surprise that Joe Biden at the last minute is going to be able to take prices back down long enough for people to forget for the midterms?
No, I don't think that's going to happen. And you also have to remember that the CPI index itself is basically rigged. You really have to double the CPI to get the actual increase in prices that Americans are experiencing. I mean, if you just take one example, which is shelter, which I think rose about 6.1%, which really was the highest, I think, since at some point in the 1980s. But if you look at the real cost of housing, I just did these calculations because over the last 2 years, median home prices are up 30%, and mortgage rates have gone from 3.1 to 6.1. So the cost of buying a home and paying a mortgage in the last 2 years is up by 84%. And so 42% just in the last year. And of course, rents are skyrocketing too. And so what the government claims as the increase in the cost of shelter is just a small fraction of what Americans are actually paying for shelter.
Yeah, that is the crazy thing, the interest rates going up and things like that. But when we talk about the interest rate rising, historically under Jimmy Carter, we had to match interest rates to inflation in order to stall the economy, which is how you end a recession, which we are technically in. So if we're just seeing interest rates tick up a little bit now, I mean, they're talking about 4% coming out of the Fed eventually by the end of the year, maybe. If inflation is still up at 8.3%, are we going to see them trickle up that high?
Well, you're exactly right. First of all, we are in a recession, as much as the Biden administration and even the Fed want to deny that. We've already had 2 quarters of falling GDP. We're about to have a third, because I think this quarter is going to be another negative quarter. And I think the fourth quarter will probably also be negative. But you're right on inflation. In order to fight inflation with higher rates, the rate has to be higher than the inflation rate, interest rates. So you have to have positive real interest rates. So you encourage people to save, which means more capital investment and more supply. And you've got to discourage people from borrowing, so you have less demand. But we still have negative real interest rates, even if the Fed were to raise rates by 100 basis points next week, and they probably won't go by that much. But even if they did, we would still have 5% negative real interest rates. That is fueling an inflation fire. And of course, the only way to really fight inflation would be a combination of tight money and contractionary fiscal policy. We need big spending cuts coming out of Congress, but unfortunately, they're doing the opposite. They're stimulating consumption with more deficit spending. The last 3 congressional actions, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, and now the executive order to forgive student loans, all of this is adding demand into the economy, so it's acting at cross purposes with an inflation fight.
Noble concept.
Worse, not better.
Yeah, noble concept. Stop spending money we don't have. Peter Schiff, appreciate you joining us in a hurricane. Stay safe, sir.
Thank you.
Strategic Biden dumping our oil reserves and hiring 87,000 more IRS agents.